I want to tell you exactly how it felt to watch my wife hand $400,000 to the man she was sleeping with, in a room full of people who applauded while she did it. Not because the money was the point. The money stopped being the point approximately 30 seconds into the ceremony, when I understood what the gesture actually was: not a financial decision, not a political move, not an oversight. It was a declaration. It was her telling every person in that room, and me, and herself, that I was the kind of man things could be done to. That was the real communication. The money was just the language she chose to say it in. My name is Kong Juno. I am 38 years old. For the past 9 years I have been the husband of CEO Eugene, CEO of Seovance Capital Partners, a mid-sized private investment and asset structuring firm that exists in its current form almost entirely because of decisions I made in rooms where my name was not on the door. I have never needed anyone to know that. I am telling you now because the alternative is letting the story start with the applause, and the applause was not the beginning. The beginning was much quieter and much longer, and it matters that you understand the shape of it before we get to the part where everything broke. The annual performance recognition ceremony at Seovance was held in the private dining room of the Jongnyo Grand, a venue Eugene had chosen 3 years ago because its glass and steel aesthetic photographed well for the company's social media and because the minimum spend justified itself as client relationship investment on the balance sheet. 41 people in the room: board members, senior partners, 3 institutional clients who had been invited as a gesture of transparency, the company's legal counsel, the CFO whose name was Park Sung-go and who had worked with Eugene since before I entered the picture, and a scattering of senior analysts whose primary function at events like this was to provide an audience for decisions that had already been made. I was there as a senior strategic advisor, which was my official title since the organizational restructuring 14 months ago that had moved me from my previous position as head of deal architecture, a restructuring whose stated rationale had been streamlining operational clarity and whose actual rationale I had understood perfectly and chosen, at the time, not to name aloud. I sat at the table third from the front, between a client portfolio manager I had known for 6 years and an analyst who had joined the company 8 months ago and who spent most of the dinner looking at her phone in the way of someone who had not yet learned that being seen looking at your phone at these events was a career statement. The dinner was the dinner. Eugene gave the kind of speech she was very good at giving: warm, precise, calibrated to make each person in the room feel simultaneously recognized and inspired, the specific talent of someone who understood that leadership was partly a performance and had made peace with that without being cynical about it. That was one of the things I had always respected about her, even now, even in the way that you respect a quality in someone while watching that quality be used against you. She moved through the year's achievements: the Daishin acquisition close, the restructuring of the Hanguk infrastructure portfolio, the entry into the Vietnamese logistics market. These were the landmarks. I had been involved in all 3 in ways I will describe later. For now what matters is that she described them in the first person plural: we achieved, our team executed, the grammar of collective credit that is entirely appropriate for a CEO at an annual dinner and that I had never, in 9 years, heard her convert to the singular for anyone except herself and, in the past 14 months, for one other person. His name was Lim Do-kyun. 41 years old, broad-shouldered, the kind of face that reads as competent in photographs and performs confidence in rooms without requiring substance to back it up. I am describing him accurately, not cruelly, because accuracy matters and I have had a long time to be precise about him. He had been with the company for 22 months, brought in by Eugene as Director of Business Development with a compensation package that I had seen and quietly noted was structured unusually, with performance accelerators attached to deal outcomes in ways that created incentives I would not have approved if I had been in the room where those terms were set. I had not been in that room. I had asked why and received the answer that it was an executive recruitment decision and that she would explain the strategic rationale when she had time, and she had not found the time, and I had filed the observation in the part of my mind that was already, even then, beginning to build a different kind of document than the ones I prepared for clients. Lim Do-kyun and Eugene had dated briefly before she and I met. She had mentioned it once, early in our relationship, in the tone people use when they are disclosing something they want on the record but not in discussion. I had received it accordingly. She announced the special recognition bonus at 9:47, I know because I checked my watch when she said his name, a reflex I have never been able to fully explain except as the body's way of marking the moment time changed its quality. She said, the Daishin acquisition was the most complex deal this company has ever closed, and the person who deserves recognition as its primary architect is someone who worked tirelessly to bring it across the line. The board has approved a special performance recognition of $399,000, and I am proud to present it to our Director of Business Development, Lim Do-kyun. The applause was immediate and full-throated, the kind of applause that happens when a room has been told what it is applauding before it begins, when the social pressure of the occasion and the identity of the person giving the award create a current that everyone follows without stopping to ask whether the current is going in the right direction. Lim Do-kyun stood, buttoned his jacket, walked to the front of the room, shook Yujin's hand, received the framed certificate and the envelope, said something modest and well-prepared about the team effort, and sat back down. He was good at it. I will give him that. He was very good at the performance of deserving things. I sat in my chair and felt the specific quality of stillness that I have since come to understand is not calm but its architectural imitation, the body's emergency response to a situation where any visible reaction is a form of concession. My face was doing the appropriate thing, I believe. The portfolio manager next to me did not look at me, which told me he knew enough to find the moment uncomfortable. The analyst on my other side was still looking at her phone. At the front of the room, Eugene was thanking the board, the clients, the team, cycling through the closing language of a successful performance, and I was thinking about a specific Tuesday in March 14 months ago when I had sat in a coffee shop near the Dacian offices for 4 hours with their lead M&A counsel, working through a structural objection to the acquisition terms that their board had raised, an objection that had been the deal's primary obstacle for 6 weeks and that I had resolved through an argument about risk-adjusted earn-out modeling that I had developed over a weekend and that Eugene had presented to the Dacian board the following Thursday without me in the room, and that had moved the deal from conditional to committed in a single session. I was thinking about that Tuesday. I was thinking about the 4 hours, and the cold coffee, and the solution, and the Thursday presentation I had not been invited to attend. I was thinking about what it meant that the solution now lived in the official history of the deal under someone else's name. When the ceremony concluded and the room shifted into the looser geometry of post-event conversation, I stood, put my napkin on the table, walked to where Eugene was speaking with 2 board members, and waited the 30 seconds it took for a natural pause in the conversation. She looked at me. I said, "Congratulations on the Dacian close. I hope he understands what he's holding." Her expression did not change immediately, which told me she was deciding what register to respond in. She said, "Juno, this isn't the place." I said, "I know. I'm going home." I shook hands with the 2 board members, whose names I will not use here because they are not the point, and I walked across the dining room and through the door and into the corridor of the Jangmyo Grand and toward the elevator, and I was aware of exactly one person watching me leave with the kind of attention that registered the specific quality of my exit rather than simply noting my departure. That person was Park Sung-go, the CFO, who had worked with Eugene for 11 years and who was standing near the bar when I passed and who looked at me the way a structural engineer looks at a building when he hears a sound he cannot immediately identify. I did not stop to reassure him. Reassurance was no longer my department. The car was in the basement garage, a level below the hotel entrance. I sat in the driver's seat without starting the engine and I stayed there for 3 minutes, which is approximately how long it takes for the body's emergency stillness to convert back into something that functions like thought. Then I opened the glove compartment and took out the laptop sleeve that I had placed there that morning, which I had placed there deliberately, which I had known when I placed it there that there was a non-trivial probability I would need to open it tonight. Inside the sleeve was a folder organized in 11 sections, the first of which was labeled Exit Protocol in the same plain formatting I used for all professional documents, because I had learned a long time ago that the things most likely to be used against you are the ones that look like they were created in anger, and I had not created this in anger. I had created it over 4 months, carefully, legally, with full awareness of what I was building and what it would be used for and what it would cost, and the cost was something I had sat with for long enough that sitting with it no longer changed the answer. I opened the folder to the first page, which was a contact list with 12 names, and I looked at the name at the bottom, which I had added last, which I had told myself I would not use, which I had known for 6 weeks I was going to use. The name was Choi Won-jae. He was the managing partner of Meridian Asia Capital, which was Seovan's most capable competitor in the Korean mid-market and which had been trying to recruit me for 3 years and which I had declined 3 times because I had still, each of those 3 times, believed that the thing I was protecting by staying was worth protecting. I looked at Choi Won-jae's name for a moment. Then I called him. He answered on the second ring. I said, "It's Kong Juno. I told you I'd never call. I'm calling." A pause. Then his voice, level and unsurprised, with the specific quality of someone who has been waiting for a particular conversation and has had the patience to let it arrive on its own terms. I know. Tell me what you need. The first time I let Eugene take credit for something I built, I told myself it was generosity. The second time I told myself it was strategy. By the fifth or sixth time I had stopped counting and started calling it marriage, which is what you call a pattern of concessions when you have decided that the person you are making them for is worth the accumulation. I want to be fair to the version of myself that made those decisions, because he was not stupid and he was not passive in the way that word usually means. He was a person who had made a calculation and believed in the calculation and was wrong, and being wrong over a long period of time about something you have invested significantly in is its own specific kind of intelligence failure, the kind that is hardest to see because the investment itself becomes the evidence that the investment was correct. I understand him. I was him for 7 years. I am trying now to describe him accurately. Eugene and I met at a restructuring conference in Singapore in the spring of the year we were both 29. She was presenting a paper on capital structure optimization in distressed mid-market assets, and the paper was good, genuinely good, with a clarity of argument and a willingness to challenge received methodology that was rare in conference presentations, which tend toward the safely conventional because safety is what gets you invited back. I was in the audience because I had been brought as an analyst attachment to a senior partner from the firm I worked at then, and I had no formal reason to be in the room except that the paper's title had interested me and I had chosen it over 2 competing sessions, which is one of those small decisions that only acquires meaning in retrospect. I introduced myself afterward. She was direct and unperformative in conversation, which I found immediately interesting because most people at conferences were performing a version of themselves designed for professional consumption, and she seemed to have decided not to bother, which at 29 I read as confidence and which I still believe was confidence, the genuine kind, before it curdled into something else. We exchanged cards. We had dinner 3 weeks later in Seoul. We were together within 2 months. We were married 2 years after that. The company was her idea and her name and her vision in the sense that she conceived it, incorporated it, and spent the first 8 months running it on willpower and a client list she had built through 6 years of exceptional work at 2 previous firms. I want to be clear about that because fairness requires it. Siovance Capital Partners was Eugene's creation and she was its public identity and its primary relationship engine in ways that were real and not performative. What she was not, and had never been, was the person who understood the structural architecture of what she was building well enough to know when it was about to break and how to fix it before it did. That was my function. Not because I had claimed it and not because she had formally assigned it, but because the problems found me the way structural problems find the person in the room who can see them, which is to say inevitably and without ceremony. The first significant example was the Kyungwon Fund restructuring in our second year. Eugene had taken on a mandate to restructure a mid-market equity fund whose LP agreements contained a conflict clause that nobody had flagged during onboarding because nobody had read the full agreement with the specific kind of patience that conflict clauses require. When the conflict surfaced, the LPs were within 2 weeks of invoking a withdrawal provision that would have ended the mandate and damaged Eugene's reputation at precisely the moment when her reputation was the company's primary asset. I spent 4 days with the fund documents, identified a reinterpretation of the conflict definition that was legally defensible and structurally coherent, wrote a 12-page memo to the LP representatives, and resolved the conflict before any of them had decided to escalate. Eugene presented the resolution to the LPs in a call I listened to from the next room. She told them her team had identified the structural path forward, which was accurate as a statement and functioned as something else as a representation. The LPs thanked her. The mandate continued. She brought home champagne that evening and said, "We make a good team," and I believed her, and the champagne was good, and I did not name the specific distribution of the work because naming it felt small against the genuine pleasure of the problem being solved, and this was the first time I made that particular choice and it established a pattern that I did not understand as a pattern for several more years. There were others. The Hanrim Logistics debt restructuring in year 3, where I identified a covenant breach in the senior facility that their CFO had missed and that would have triggered a cross-default cascade if it had reached the lender's monitoring team first. I found it, modeled the cure path, negotiated a standstill directly with the facility agent over a 10-day period while presenting to Eugene each evening as a progress briefing, and she closed the final agreement in a meeting I did not attend. Because by that point we had developed an informal understanding that client-facing closure was her domain and structural problem-solving was mine, an understanding I had accepted as sensible division of labor and that I now understand was the architecture of invisibility being built one agreement at a time. The Dacian acquisition. The Hanguk infrastructure portfolio restructuring. The Vietnamese market entry, which had required 6 months of relationship building with a state-adjacent infrastructure fund whose principals I had met through a personal connection from my graduate years and whose trust had been built on the understanding that they were dealing with me specifically, not with a brand. These were the landmarks. In each of them I was present as the structure that held the visible work upright, and in each of them the visible work was attributed to someone else's intelligence, first to Eugen's, which had its own legitimacy, and then increasingly to Lim Do-kyun's, which had none. My assistant's name is Lee Chan. She has worked with me for 4 years, which means she joined the company 2 years before Lim Do-kyun arrived and has watched the organizational shift with the specific clarity of someone who was observant, loyal, and sufficiently junior that people say things in front of her they would not say in front of someone they considered a witness. She is 27 years old and she is one of the most precisely intelligent people I have encountered in a professional context, and I say this not as a compliment to myself for recognizing it but as a relevant fact about the quality of information she has brought me over the past several months, during which she has functioned as the clearest signal in a room full of noise. It was Cheon who first told me, 7 months ago, that my name had been removed from the distribution list of the weekly deal strategy email that I had personally established and formatted 3 years earlier. She mentioned it carefully, in the phrasing of someone who was not sure whether she was telling me something I didn't know or something I did know and had chosen not to address, and I received it accordingly. I told her I was aware and that I would look into the technical issue, which was a lie in the register of professional composure, because there was no technical issue and we both knew it. 2 weeks after that she told me I had not been included in the calendar invitation for the Dacian pre-close review meeting, for which I had written the risk summary that was being presented. I said, "Who sent the invite?" She said, "Director Lim's office." I said, "Thank you, Cheon." She said nothing else. She had told me what she needed to tell me. The systematic removal happened in stages that were individually deniable and cumulatively unmistakable. Email distribution lists. Meeting invitations. Presentation decks where my analysis appeared under revised authorship or had been broken into components and distributed across multiple sections so that no single section was attributably mine. Client introductions where I was present for the relationship building and absent for the closing, which meant the client's mental model of who had delivered the value gradually shifted to whoever was in the room for the close, which was increasingly Lim Do-kyun. Access credentials. 6 months ago I noticed that my access to the company's deal pipeline management system had been restricted to read-only for the active deal folders, which meant I could see what was happening but could not contribute documentation, which is the digital equivalent of being permitted to watch a conversation through a window. I had raised this with the IT manager, who had told me it had been an administrative change ordered through the executive office and that he would check on the restoration, and the restoration had not come, and I had not raised it again, because I was already, by that point, building the folder in the glove compartment of my car and I had begun to understand that visibility into the system was more useful than participation in it. There is a thing I need to say about Eugene that the anger of the Jangyo Grand Dining Room makes it tempting to omit and that I am going to say anyway because honesty about what I lost is as important as honesty about what was done to me. The woman I married at 31 was someone I admired in a way I have not been able to fully replicate in my assessment of other people since. She was rigorous and funny and had a quality of attention in conversation that made you feel that what you were saying was the most interesting thing she had encountered that day, which I later understood was partly a professional skill but which in the early years was also something genuine, something that came from real curiosity about ideas and people, and which made her good at the work in ways that were not reducible to performance. I loved her. I want that to be in the record. I loved the person she was when the company was small and the problems were hard and we stayed up until 2 a.m. at the kitchen table working through structures together, and she would say wait, say that again when I was explaining something and she would write it down and then look at it and say yes, that's right, that's the thing, and there was something about those moments that felt like the correct use of two people's intelligence. I loved that. I grieved it long before the Jangyo Grand. I had been grieving it for approximately 2 years before the ceremony, which is why I was prepared for the ceremony and why my preparation did not look like grief. Cheon came to my home office the morning after the ceremony. She did not call ahead. She had a key because I had given her one 18 months ago for document delivery purposes, and she had never used it for anything except document delivery, and the fact that she came in person and unannounced told me before she spoke that what she was carrying was not a conversation for phone or message. She sat down across from me and put a printed document on the desk and said, "I found this in the secondary accounts payable archive last night. I was working late and I was in a folder I had legitimate access to. I want you to know that before you read it." I said I understood. She said, the $399,000 wasn't a standalone payment. It was structured as the final tranche of a series of disbursements to 4 external consultants over the past 8 months. 3 of the 4 consultants are registered to the same address in Mapo. The 4th is registered to an address in Busan that I cross-referenced with corporate filings. The director of the Busan entity is a name I recognized from Director Lim's personal bio on the company website. It's his university roommate. She said this in the same controlled, specific voice she used for all professional communication, and when she finished she looked at me with the expression of someone who has just handed another person a lit object and is waiting to understand whether it will be handled safely. I looked at the document. I looked at the consultant names and the disbursement amounts and the registration addresses. The total across the 8-month series was not $399,000. It was $1,240,000. The $399,000 was the ceremony. The rest had been the rehearsal. The 4 consultants were named on consulting partners, BDX Strategic Solutions, Korean Advisory Group, and a 4th entity called JNP Research and Development. I want to walk through what each of them was and was not, because the architecture of a false consulting structure is less dramatic than it sounds and more precise than most people imagine, and the precision is what makes it useful as evidence. On Consulting Partners had a business registration dated 14 months ago, a registered address in Mapo that turned out to be a shared office service provider of the kind that rents a mailing address for 40,000 won a month with no physical occupancy requirement, a single listed director whose name appeared nowhere in any professional database Chaein could access, and invoices to Seovance totaling 180 million Korean wons across 7 months for services described as strategic market analysis and sector advisory. BDX Strategic Solutions was registered 11 months ago, same Mapo address as on, different director name, invoices totaling 215 million Korean wons for transaction support and deal facilitation consulting. Korean Advisory Group, 10 months old, same address, 190 million Korean wons for business development research and relationship management. These 3 entities shared not only an address but, as Chaein established through a cross-reference of corporate registration documents that are public record in Korea and that nobody at Seovance had apparently thought to check, the same registered agent, a small accounting firm in Yeongdeungpo whose principal client list, visible through their own website's testimonials section, included 2 other companies that Lim Do-kyun had previously worked at before joining Seovance. The 4th entity, JNP Research and Development in Busan, was the most straightforward of the 4. Its listed director was a man named Jang Hyun-soo, and the company website, which was sparse and poorly maintained in the way of entities that exist for structural rather than operational purposes, contained in its About section a single paragraph mentioning that the firm's founding team included alumni of Yonsei University's business program, class of 2006, which was Lim Do-kyun's graduation year, and Jang Hyun-soo's LinkedIn profile, which Chaein found in approximately 4 minutes of searching, listed under Education, Yonsei University, 2002 to 2006, and under the Activities section, which people fill in carelessly because nobody thinks it will matter, roommate and founding partner of the Yonsei Investment and Strategy Club with Lim Do-kyun. I looked at this for a long time. Then I looked at Chaein. She said, "I know." I said, "How long did it take you to find all of this?" She said, "Last night. About 4 hours." I said, "Why?" She said, "Because I've been watching what they've been doing to you for 8 months and I was waiting to find out if it was as bad as it looked." I said, "It's worse." She said, "I know that too." The question of what Eugene knew was one I sat with for 3 days before I arrived at an answer I could trust. I want to be precise about this because the answer matters for reasons that are not only personal. There are 2 possible versions of Eugene's relationship to the consultant scheme. In the first version, she did not know. The disbursements were routed through approval chains that Lim Do-kyun had constructed to minimize CEO-level visibility. The invoice descriptions were generic enough to pass routine review, and the amounts, while significant in aggregate, had been disbursed in individual tranches below the threshold that would have triggered executive sign-off under the company's authorization matrix. In this version, Eugene was deceived by someone she trusted, and the scheme was something done around her rather than with her. In the second version, she knew. Not necessarily the specific details, not the Mapo address, not Jang Hyunsa's name, but the general shape, that Lim Do-kyun was running money through external entities, that the money was notionally attached to legitimate project work, and that the arrangement was one she had chosen not to examine because examining it would have required a confrontation she preferred to defer. I spent 3 days with the two versions, and on the third day I looked at the authorization matrix for the company's accounts payable function, which I had access to because I had designed it in year 2 and retained red access despite the credential restrictions applied to my other systems, and I found that the authorization threshold had been revised 14 months ago. Coincidentally, the month Lim Do-kyun's first consultant entity was registered from 50 million Korean wons to 120 million Korean wons per invoice, signed off by the CEO. The revision moved every one of the consultant invoices below the executive sign-off threshold. It had been signed by Eugene. I looked at that signature for a long time. I did not reach a conclusion about whether she had understood what she was signing when she signed it or whether she had understood it fully and had chosen it with open eyes. I reached a different conclusion, which was that the distinction no longer mattered for the purpose of what I was going to do next. I called Choi Won-jae at Meridian Asia Capital the morning after Cheon's visit. We had spoken briefly the night of the ceremony, long enough for me to tell him I was ready to have a real conversation and for him to tell me to call in when I was. He answered immediately, which told me he had been waiting in the way that patient people wait, not anxiously, but ready. We spoke for 90 minutes. I told him approximately 60% of what I knew, which was the 60% that established my value and my position and my intentions without giving him leverage over any element I was not yet ready to move. He was a careful listener, the kind that processes in real time rather than preparing his next statement while you're still speaking, and when I finished he said, "What do you need from me right now?" I said, "Nothing yet. I need you to know that when I move, I will move toward you, and I need you to be in a position to receive that movement cleanly and quickly." He said, "How long?" I said, "Weeks, not months." He said, "I'll be ready." This was the first external piece of what I thought of as the outgoing architecture, the structure I had been quietly assembling for the past 4 months that would allow me to extract from Seovance the things that were genuinely mine and transfer them to a context where they would function under my name rather than someone else's. I want to be honest about the ethics of this. I was not planning to steal from the company. I was planning to stop lending to it without compensation, which is a different operation and a defensible one, though the line between them is one I was careful to keep clearly on the right side of throughout. The first elegant move, as I had planned it, involved a client named Oh Chang-soo. He was 63 years old and had been the principal of a mid-sized manufacturing conglomerate for 21 years, and he had been a Seovance client for 6 of those years, and he had been my client in the specific sense that the relationship existed between him and me personally rather than between him and the firm's brand, a distinction that some clients observe and others do not, and that Oh Chang-soo observed absolutely. I knew this because he had told me directly, 18 months ago, in a dinner at a restaurant he had chosen specifically for its privacy, at which he had said, "Juno, I want you to understand that when I work with your firm, I am working with you. If you are not there, I am not there." I had received that as the trust it was intended as and had not repeated it to Eugene because, even then, I had understood that she would receive it as a threat to the firm's institutional identity rather than as a testament to my professional value, and institutional identity was always, for her, the priority. I called Oh Chang-soo on a Tuesday. He was expecting the call in the way that people who pay close attention to institutional dynamics are expecting things they do not yet know they are expecting. I told him I was in the process of a professional transition and that I wanted to speak with him before the transition became public, because his mandate, a long-term asset restructuring engagement that had been running for 3 years and was at a critical juncture, deserved continuity of attention that I could not guarantee through my current structure. He said, "Are you leaving?" I said, "I'm reorienting." He said, "Then tell me where you're orienting to, and I will tell you whether my mandate follows." I told him. He said, "Send me the paperwork." The morning call where Lim Do-kyun failed in front of the room was not something I engineered. It was something I allowed to happen by removing a support structure he had never known existed. For the past 14 months, whenever there was a client-facing call involving a deal that I had structured or a relationship I had built, I had been providing Lim Do-kyun with what I told myself were briefing notes but what were actually, I understood now, a complete technical foundation that he converted into fluency. The notes covered the structural rationale for each deal element, the client's primary concerns, the risk factors that needed to be addressed in a specific order, and the one or two technical questions that experienced counterparties always asked and that needed precise answers rather than confident approximations. He had been presenting from my material for 14 months and the room had been crediting him with the understanding that the material represented. The Wednesday morning call was with the senior team from a Seoul-based pension fund considering a co-investment in a real estate debt structure that I had modeled and that Lim Do-kyun was leading on the client-facing side. I did not send him the briefing notes. I sent him a calendar notification of the call time, which was the only contribution to the call that was actually mine to give, and I let the rest proceed without me. I was not on the call. I had not been invited to be on the call, per the organizational pattern of the past several months. But Chaeyeon was in the building and sent me a message at 10:47, 12 minutes into the scheduled 30-minute call, that read, "He's been asked to explain the duration mismatch and the liability stack 3 times. He's given 3 different answers. One of the pension fund people just asked if there was someone else they could speak to about the structural detail." I read that message. I put my phone down. I felt something that was not quite satisfaction and not quite grief but occupied the space between them. The specific emotion of watching a consequence arrive that you predicted accurately and wished had not been necessary to predict. At 11:03 Chaeyeon sent a second message, "Call ended early." He said he'd follow up in writing. They asked for the follow-up to come from the deal's original architect. He said he would arrange it. I replied, "He can't arrange it." She replied, "I know." Park Sung-go, the CFO, called me that afternoon. I had been expecting this contact for different reasons than the ones that produced it, and the reasons that actually produced it told me something useful. He said, "Juno, there's a situation with the pension fund call this morning that I think you need to know about." I said, "Tell me." He described what Chaeyeon had already told me, and then he said something he had not said to me in 3 years of increasingly strained organizational dynamics. "I think we have a problem that goes beyond this morning." I said, "How long have you thought that?" A pause. He said, "Longer than I've been comfortable with. I want to talk properly." I said, "Come to my home office Thursday morning. Don't tell anyone you're coming." He said, "Okay." He did not ask why the secrecy was necessary, which told me he already understood why. That evening, at 9:41, my phone showed a message from Eugene. We had not spoken since the ceremony 3 days earlier, which was the longest we had gone without direct communication in 9 years of marriage and which had the quality of a held breath rather than a resolved silence. The message read, "We need to talk. Not about the ceremony. About the company. Can you come home tonight or tomorrow morning? No drama." I read the message 4 times, which is 3 more times than its content required and the exact number of times it takes to separate what a message says from what it does not say and from what its arrival at this specific moment means. The timing told me the pension fund call had reached her, or that something else had moved in a direction she had not anticipated, or both. The phrase "not about the ceremony" told me she was still, even now, organizing the situation in the way that protected her version of events. The ceremony was the small thing, the company was the large thing, and she wanted to discuss the large thing while keeping the small thing in a category where it could not be re-examined. The phrase "no drama" told me she expected me to be the source of drama, which told me she did not yet understand what register I was operating in. I put the phone down without replying. I would reply in the morning, after my meeting with Sung-go, when I had one more piece of the picture assembled. She could wait one night. She had had 14 months to understand what she was doing. I could take 8 hours, I replied to Eugene at 7:14, after Sung-go had left. 4 words, "I'll be there at 7. She answered within 40 seconds. She met me at the door dressed for the office. She said, "I know you're angry about the ceremony." I said, "I'm not angry." She said, "I can fix the compensation, a deferred equity package. The number is larger than the bonus." When she finished, I said, "No." She looked at me with an expression I had not seen before. She said, "Then what do you actually want?" I said, "An honest accounting of the last 4 years. How much of the Dacian structure did Do-kyun build?" Because I wrote the compliance analysis that saved it in March. I held Strathmore for 2 years before Dacian existed. Do-kyun presented 3 of my slides in April with my name removed. She said, "Teams build things." I said, "Yes." And for 4 years you've been taking credit for the team. Her phone lit on the counter. Do-kyun. She didn't answer. She said, "You're making this personal." I said, "You handed $400,000 to the man you used to sleep with, at a company dinner, for work that I did. Which part is not personal?" She sat. Her voice lost its register. I said, "You're preserving a structure I no longer want to be preserved inside." I picked up my jacket. She said, "Don't leave." I said, "I'm going to work." As the elevator closed, I heard her finally answer Do-kyun's call, voice dropping to the register she used when she believed no one was listening. In the parking structure, I opened the file Cheon had sent at 7:09, 5 minutes before my reply to Eugene. A screenshot. A thread between Eugene and Do-kyun, dated 4 months earlier. The first line read, the Juno situation clean exit timeline. 14 messages. I read every one. By the last I understood, the ceremony was not a decision made that evening. It was an execution. The plan had been written while I was still inside the building, still inside the marriage, still under the assumption that what we were building together was something we were actually building together. Park Sung-go arrived at my home office at 8:43 on Thursday morning, 17 minutes early, which told me he had been unable to sleep past 6 and had driven in circles before deciding to simply appear. He was 54, methodical, the kind of man who wore the same quality of suit regardless of the day's significance because consistency was itself his form of authority. He had been Eugene's CFO for 11 years and understood the financial architecture of Seovance with the granularity of someone who had built it from inside. He sat down, accepted coffee, looked at the folder I had placed in the center of the desk, and said, "How long have you had this?" I said, "The material in its current form, 4 months. The full picture, longer." He was quiet. Then he said, "The board doesn't know about the consultant structure." I said, "The board hasn't been given reason to look." "There's a difference." He absorbed that. I said, "I need you to tell me what you know about the Meridian conversation." He looked at me. I said, Do-kyun has been in preliminary talks with Meridian Asia Capital about lifting out the Vietnamese book. Choi Won-jae told me himself, because he found the approach inappropriate and thought I should know. What I need to understand is whether Eugene sanctioned that conversation or whether Do-kyun has moved outside her control entirely. Sung-go set down his coffee cup with the specific care of a man placing something he does not want to drop. He said, "She didn't sanction it. Or if she did, she didn't tell me." I said, "Then either she doesn't know, which means he's operating outside even her perimeter, or she knows and has chosen not to loop you in, which means the separation between you and the decision-making center has already happened." He said nothing. I said, "Either way, your position as CFO depends on which of those is true, and you don't currently know which it is." A long silence. Then, "What are you going to do?" I said, "There is a full board and investor review meeting next Wednesday. The consultant disbursements, the limb compensation series, and the Meridian approach will be on the table regardless of whether anyone intended to put them there. I will be attending in a capacity that cannot be refused, and I will present documentation that requires a formal response. I'm not asking for your help. I'm telling you what is going to happen so you can decide where you want to be standing when it does." He looked at me for a long time. Then he said, "I'll be in the room." The quarterly investor and board review was held in the company's primary conference suite on the 14th floor of the Gwanghwamun building, a room I had sat in 43 times by my own count and that I had not been formally invited to attend for the past 3 quarters. I had retained, through an instrument I had drafted myself in year 3 and that Eugene had signed during a period when she believed we were building protective infrastructure together, a standing observer right for any session where the company's core structural assets were under discussion, attached to my minority equity stake of 11%. The observer right had never been invoked. I invoked it on Monday morning, via formal written notice delivered through my attorney to the company's legal counsel and to each board member's registered correspondence address. By Tuesday I had received 3 replies, one from legal counsel, acknowledging receipt in language that communicated discomfort without locating a legal objection, one from a board member named Jang Yunsik that said only noted, Wednesday 9 a.m., and one from Eugene's personal number at 11:47 at night, "This is not how we agreed to handle this." I replied, "We never agreed. You assumed. I let you." She did not write back. I arrived at the 14th floor at 8:55, 5 minutes ahead of the scheduled start. I wanted to be in the room before Lim Do-kyun, not to claim territory theatrically but because the room's spatial geometry had meaning and I wanted to have made my choices before his presence could introduce ambiguity. I took a seat on the right side, 2/3 toward the far end, sightlines to the screen in both entry points, positioned neither at Eugen's end nor at the subordinate clustering near the table's foot. Present by right, engaged by preparation, not waiting to be acknowledged. The institutional attendees filled in over the following minutes. Bak Hyungman from the NPS co-investment desk greeted me with the faint surprise of someone encountering a face in a context where it had been recently absent. Song Mikyung from Hana Asset Management's Alternatives Group, attending for the first time, scanned the room with the evaluative attention of someone not yet certain what she was looking at. And then Lee Jae-soo, 61 years old, managing director of the Somail Infrastructure Fund, one of Seovan's 3 largest LP relationships, a figure whose institutional weight in the room was of a categorically different order than anyone else present. He sat directly across from me and looked at me once when he sat down, the brief, assessing look of a person calibrating the significance of a detail, and then he looked at the presentation screen and did not look at me again, which meant he was either indifferent to my presence or processing it very carefully, and Lee Jae-soo had not built a 40 billion won infrastructure fund by being indifferent to details. Eugene entered at 9:02, Lim Do-kyun one step behind her and to her right in the positional grammar of professional adjacency that communicates a relationship without stating it. She saw me before she reached her chair. Her expression held in the way that well-controlled expressions hold under genuine surprise, the hold itself visible to anyone who knew the difference between her natural face and her maintained one. Do-kyun saw me 1 second later and his response was different, a brief hardening around the jaw, a micro-adjustment of posture, the physical vocabulary of a man who has encountered an obstacle he had not mapped. Neither of them said anything. I said nothing. Eugene took her seat and opened the session with the efficiency of someone who had decided that the correct response to an unwanted variable was to proceed as though the room contained only the variables she had planned for. For 40 minutes the meeting was the meeting: quarterly performance, portfolio status, Vietnamese logistics update, pipeline commentary, risk register. Lim Do-kyun presented 2 sections with the confidence of a person who had learned to perform fluency convincingly in front of audiences who lacked the technical depth to probe it. I asked no questions. I took no notes. I was simply present in the way that a correctly filed document is present, not dramatic, not insistent, but existing in a location where it cannot be misplaced. The session opened for questions at 10:19. Song Mikyung asked about the risk allocation methodology in the current infrastructure portfolio. Do-kyun's answer was 3 sentences long and generically correct and failed entirely to engage with the specific CVAR framework the portfolio actually used, a framework I had developed in year 4 with a nuance in its tail event weighting that his answer implicitly misrepresented. Song Mikyung looked at her notes. Then Lee Jae-soo said, I want to understand the liability duration profile in the Hanguk infrastructure book. Specifically the mismatch between the senior tranche's 3-year step-down and the projected cash flow timing on the Incheon asset cluster. The last model I saw showed a potential liquidity gap in months 19 through 22. How is that currently being managed? It was a precise question. It told you the person asking it had read the actual documents rather than the executive summary. Do-kyun said, the Incheon cluster is performing in line with original projections and the treasury team is monitoring the duration profile closely. Lee Jae-soo said, that is not an answer to my question. A brief silence. Do-kyun said, the senior facility has a built-in reserve mechanism that addresses the liquidity window. Lee Jae-soo said, what is the size of the reserve, and at what coverage ratio does the mechanism trigger? Do-kyun said, I'll need to follow up with the specific numbers. Lee Jae-soo said, the specific numbers were in the Q2 structural update circulated to LPs 3 weeks ago. The silence this time had a different texture. I waited 3 seconds and then I said, the reserve is 8.4 billion Korean wons, sized at 1.3 times the projected liquidity gap at the month 19 trough. The trigger is a coverage ratio below 1.1. As of the last monitoring report I reviewed Monday, the current ratio is 1.47. The gap is being managed, but the monitoring cadence should be quarterly rather than monthly, because the Incheon cluster's cash timing has drifted right of the base case and monthly monitoring creates a false sense of precision. I flagged this in a memo to the deal team 6 weeks ago. Lee Jae-soo looked at me. He said, "You are Kong Juno." I said, "Yes." He said, "I know your name. I have been wondering for 18 months why it does not appear on these presentations." I said, "So have I." The quality of the silence that followed was of the kind that happens when a room understands that a register has shifted and is recalibrating how to read everything it has already heard. Eugene said, in the precise, controlled tone of someone who was not going to be destabilized in front of investors regardless of what she felt, "Juno's observation is noted and will be addressed in the post-session review." I said, "I have one more item that may be more appropriate for the session itself." She looked at me. I said, "The documentation distributed to each board member and investor at the table this morning addresses structural questions about the company's advisory disbursements over the past 8 months that are relevant to the current governance review. I would like to walk through the summary section before the session closes." Lim Dokyeon said, "This is not on the agenda." I said, "Observer rights include the right to introduce material relevant to the protection of equity interests. I'm exercising that right." He said, "This is not the forum for a personal grievance." I looked at him with the attention I had been preparing for 14 months and said, "Dokyeon, tell me the name of the registered director of On Consulting Partners, the entity that invoiced the company for 180 million Korean wons in strategic market analysis over 7 months and that shares a registered address, a registration agent, and a corporate filing pattern with 3 other entities that collectively received 1,240 million Korean wons from this company in the same period." The room went completely still. He said nothing. I said, "Take your time." Song Mikyoung had opened her folder and was reading. Lee Jae-soo was looking at Dokyeon with the patient, unsurprised expression of someone who has seen this exact moment before and knows how it ends. Eugen's face was doing what I had seen it do twice in 9 years, absolute professional control being applied at the boundary of what professional control could fully contain, and the effort of that containment visible to anyone watching for it. I said nothing further. The room did the workrooms do when correct information finally enters them, which is to reorganize around a different understanding of what it has been told, and that reorganization did not require my assistance. Dokyeon said the documents were out of context and represented a mischaracterization of legitimate business development expenditures. His voice was level and his delivery was prepared, which meant he had received some advance notice and had constructed a response. The response was the wrong shape, because it addressed the legitimacy of the expenditures rather than the identity of their recipients, and the identity was the question that had been asked. Lee Jae-soo said, "What is the specific deliverable for the 180 million Korean won strategic market analysis?" Dokyeon said, "A series of sector reports that informed our business development strategy." Lee Jae-soo said, "Are those reports available for LP review?" A pause. "They can be compiled." Lee Jae-soo said, "The answer to that question is either yes or no." Song Mikyoung said, without looking up, "The registration address for 3 of the 4 entities is a shared office service in Mapo. They offer virtual mailbox services. I don't understand how sector reports are produced from a virtual mailbox." It was not said aggressively. It was said in the particular tone of a professional who has moved from assessment to decision, and the decision was that she was not comfortable, and stating that in a quarterly LP review was a form of institutional action that carried weight of its own. After the session, which ran 40 minutes past its scheduled close, I stood in the corridor by the elevator bank while the room emptied. Most participants left quickly, in the manner of people who needed to be somewhere private before they could process what they had witnessed. Song Mikyoung shook my hand and gave me her card. Sunggo paused beside me, looked at me for a moment, said nothing, walked on. Lee Jae-soo was the last through the door. He stopped beside me and said, "You were very disciplined in there." I said, "I had more time to prepare than anyone knew." He said, "I'm going to give you a number. Someone in my office. Call tomorrow morning." He handed me a card and went to the elevator. My phone vibrated as his elevator descended. The message was from an unknown number. "We need 2 minutes. Loading dock, B2. Don't come back through the lobby." The loading dock was empty except for a board member named Cho Byung-hak, late 50s, who had sat at the table and said nothing for the entire session. He was standing near the fire door with his jacket on and his phone in his hand. He said, 5 minutes, maximum. Nobody knows I'm here. I said, "Then say it." He said, "The board has been aware for approximately 6 weeks that the governance situation is untenable. We've been trying to determine the correct sequence. What happened today changes that sequence. We need the company to survive the next 7 days. There are 3 LP renewal conversations that cannot happen in the shadow of what you put on the table this morning. We're asking you to hold the remaining documentation until the week is out." I said, "You're asking me to delay?" He said, 7 days. In exchange, the board will move to remove Lim Do-kyun with cause before the end of the month. I said, "And Eugene?" He looked at me and said, "That's not a conversation the board is in a position to have." I looked at him. I said, "So you want to remove the instrument and preserve the hand that used it?" He said, "We want to preserve the company." I said, "I'll call you tomorrow morning." He went back through the fire door. I stood in the loading dock of a building where I had worked for 9 years, holding Lee Jae-su's card in one pocket and an offer that wasn't quite what it appeared to be in the other, and I thought about the difference between ending something completely and letting it end in the right direction, and whether patience was still strategy or whether it had become something else. The fluorescent lights were the particular shade of institutional white that makes everything under them look like it is waiting for a decision. I was waiting for a decision. I took the elevator to the parking level, sat in the car for 3 minutes, and drove home to think. The legal letter arrived on Friday at 8:41 in the morning. I knew it was coming, not because I was paranoid, but because for 7 years I had watched Eugene respond to situations where she lost control. Her first instinct was never reconciliation. Her first instinct was construction: find a document, build a frame, designate the responsible party in writing before the responsible party had a chance to designate themselves differently. I understood this with respect, because that instinct was what had made her a good CEO. I understood it with cold precision, because now it was aimed at me. The letter was signed by Kim Seon-chul of the corporate practice at Han & Lee, one of the 3 leading Korean law firms that specialized in what was publicly called protection of institutional interests and privately called something more accurate, the clean removal of inconvenient people. Kim Seon-chul had handled matters for Seovance twice before. I had been present at both briefings. He knew my signature on company documents as well as Eugene did. The letter contained 3 positions. The first was a non-compete enforcement notice. It cited my departure from Seovance's internal advisory structure, my contact with Choi Won-jae at Meridian Asia Capital, and the transfer of the Oh Chang-soo mandate as constituting a breach of the non-compete clause in my original employment agreement, executed 6 years ago. The letter stated that my continued engagement with any entity in the mid-market Korean investment sector would expose me to civil damages claims that Han & Lee had valued, in a preliminary assessment, at 2.3 billion Korean wons. I read that number twice, not because it surprised me but because the precision of it was designed to. Round numbers are threats. Precise numbers are calculations. Kim Seon-chul wanted me to believe that someone had sat down and done the arithmetic, which was meant to communicate that the math would hold up in a courtroom. I set the letter on the desk and did not call anyone for 11 minutes. I needed 11 minutes to be alone with the number before I could work with it accurately. The second position was a trade secret claim. It alleged that in the course of my departure I had removed or retained proprietary deal documentation, client intelligence, and structural analysis belonging to Seovance Capital Partners, and that this documentation was now being used to facilitate competitive client engagements in violation of my confidentiality obligations. The specific items named were 3: the Daishin Acquisition Compliance Analysis, the Hanguk Infrastructure Portfolio Sensitivity Model, and the Vietnamese Market Entry Relationship Documentation. I read this section more slowly than the first. Not because it was legally stronger, it was not, but because it named the 3 pieces of work that I had built most carefully over the longest period of time, and seeing them listed as Seovance property in a legal document had a quality I was not prepared for, which was grief. Not anger. Grief. The specific kind that arrives when something you made with real effort is claimed by someone who did not make it, not in the informal register of organizational credit theft that I had already processed over 14 months, but in the formal register of legal ownership, black letters on firm letterhead, a junior associate's careful citation formatting. I gave the grief approximately 90 seconds. Then I moved to the third position. The third was a reputational injunction request. It sought to prevent me from making any public or private statements to clients, counterparties, institutional contacts, or media entities regarding internal Seovance personnel, compensation decisions, or operational matters, citing a confidentiality clause in my employment agreement that covered, and here was the precise language, all matters relating to company culture, personnel management, and executive decision-making processes. That clause had been drafted during a period when Eugene had been concerned about a former senior analyst who had left with information about a compensation dispute. I had reviewed the clause at the time and suggested 2 modifications that had been incorporated. I had signed the agreement that contained it. And I had, over the 6 months that followed, quietly built a position that the clause, as written, did not cover what it purported to cover, a position that my own legal counsel, Jang Minjun, had confirmed in a 45-minute call 3 weeks before the ceremony, during which he had also confirmed 7 other positions that I expected to need. I called Jang Minjun at 9:14. He had already seen the letter. Kim Seonchul's office had sent a copy to him simultaneously, which was standard procedure when both parties were represented, and which told me that Eugene had moved faster than I expected, or that Dokyeon had pushed her to move faster, which was the same thing with a different origin. Jang said, they filed the non-compete first because it's the most visible. They want you on the defensive before you have time to establish narrative. How do you want to handle the public posture? I said, no public posture. Let them build theirs. He said, they're going to brief industry contacts by end of day. Kim Seonchul's firm does that. They'll frame it as a rogue employee and a partner dispute. I said, good. I need them to use that frame. A pause. Then, you're letting them set the story. I said, I'm letting them commit to the story. He understood. One of the qualities that made Jang Minjun worth what I paid him was that he moved through implications quickly and did not require them to be spelled out. He said, timeline on the non-compete response? I said, Monday. File the compensation history first. Every month I was at Seovance, every structure I built, every client I managed. Full documentation. Let the non-compete claim sit next to the compensation record and let the math speak. And the trade secret claim? Tuesday. With the original file creation timestamps, the edit histories, and the 3 email chains where Eugene asked me to build each of the named documents specifically. Her requests, in writing, under her name. And the confidentiality injunction? Wednesday. With the clause analysis you prepared. I want Kim Seonchul to spend his weekend explaining to Eugene why the clause she thought was her containment tool is the clause that establishes she knew the information existed and chose not to disclose it. Jang said, you prepared for this? I said, for 4 months. He said, she doesn't know that. I said, she knows I'm organized. She doesn't know the organization extends this far. That's the difference. After I hung up, I sat for a moment with what I was doing, which I did periodically throughout this period, not to second-guess it but to ensure that the clarity I believed I had was real clarity and not the specific confidence of someone who had convinced himself that careful preparation was the same thing as correct judgment. They are related but not identical. I have met people who built very precise plans in the wrong direction. I did not believe I was one of them. But I wanted to keep checking. Lim Dokyeon made his first independent mistake on the same Friday, at 12:40, which was approximately 4 hours after the legal letter arrived and approximately 3 hours after he realized, through whatever channel Eugene used to communicate with him, that the letter had been sent. I know the timing because Cheon was in the building and she called me at 12:53. She said, he called Oh Chang-soo directly. I found out through the client services coordinator because Dokyeon asked her to pull the contact history for the account, which is a normal request, except he asked her to mark it as urgent and to not log the pull in the standard system. I said, what did he say to Oh Chang-soo? I don't have the conversation. But Oh Chang-soo's office called the firm's general line 20 minutes later and asked to speak with Park Sung-go, not Dokyeon, and when the coordinator transferred the call she heard Mr. Oh say, before the transfer connected, that he wanted to understand what the firm's position was on its advisory relationships and whether the people he was working with were still representing the firm or representing themselves. I thought about that for a moment. Oh Chang-soo was not a man who asked unclear questions. The framing, representing the firm or representing themselves, was a direct echo of something Dokyeon had almost certainly said to him, a version of the claim that I was operating outside my authority, using company relationships for personal gain, in breach of my obligations. It was the trade secret claim translated into client relationship language. It was Do-kyun trying to do what Eugene had retained Han and Lee to do, except without a lawyer, without preparation, and directly to a client who had explicitly told me 18 months ago that his relationship was with me and not with the firm. I said, "What did Sungo say?" "I don't have that either." But when Sungo came out of his office after the call, he walked directly to Do-kyun's office and closed the door. I said, "How long were they in there?" 19 minutes. Do-kyun left the building at 2:03. His assistant said he had an outside meeting. I said, "He doesn't have an outside meeting." Chaeyeon said, "I know." There was a pause, and then she said, in the same controlled voice she used for all professional communication, the same voice she had used when she put the consultant documentation on my desk, "Juno, he's frightened. Frightened people do things that make the evidence cleaner." I said, "I know." She said, "I need to know if you need me to do anything today." I said, "Yes. I need you to send me the original authorization matrix for accounts payable, the version from 6 years ago, before the threshold revision. And I need the board resolution that approved the revision, if there is one." A pause. "There's no board resolution?" I said, "Find out." She called back at 3:47. There was no board resolution. The threshold revision had been authorized by a single executive sign-off, under a company policy that permitted the CEO to adjust internal approval thresholds by up to 40% without board review. The revision had moved the threshold from 50 million to 120 million won, an increase of exactly 40%. Not 41. Not 39. Exactly the maximum permitted without triggering board oversight. I wrote that number down. Then I called Jang Min-jun again. He said, "You sound like you found something." I said, "The accounts payable revision." She used the maximum allowed administrative discretion with exact precision. Which means either she or someone advising her knew the threshold exactly and designed the revision to stay under the review requirement. A moment. That's not an oversight. I said, "No. It's not. Does it change your timeline?" I said, "It changes what I file on Wednesday." The meeting I had not expected came Saturday morning. Not from Eugene. From her father. Seo Gwanjin was 71 years old and had built the family's initial capital through 3 decades in logistics and infrastructure before Eugene had taken it and converted it into the investment platform that became Seovance. He had been formally uninvolved in the company since its incorporation, a deliberate structural decision that Eugene had insisted on, correctly, because the presence of a founding patriarch on the cap table would have complicated the institutional investor relationships she was building. But uninvolved formally was not the same as uninvolved in practice, and the fact that he had called and asked to meet, not at a restaurant or a club but at the small office he kept in Mapo where he handled his personal holdings, told me that this meeting was off every record that Eugene would see. I went. I went because I respected the man's intelligence and because understanding the full shape of what was moving against me required listening to every voice that was trying to reach me, and because, if I was honest, there was a part of me that still wanted someone who had known Eugene longer than I had to offer me a version of events that changed the answer. He met me at the door. He was wearing the kind of plain clothing that very wealthy men wear when they want to signal that the meeting is personal and not institutional. He poured tea without asking whether I wanted any and sat across from me and said, "You know why I asked you to come?" I said, "I have a hypothesis." He said, "Eugene told me about the legal action." She presented it as a necessary protective measure. She used the word unfortunate. He looked at his tea. She uses that word when she has done something she has decided not to re-examine. I said, "Has she told you about the consultant payments?" His expression did not change, but something behind it did. He said, "Tell me what you know." I told him, not everything, but the architecture, 4 entities, 14 months, 1.24 million in total disbursements, the Mapo address, the authorization threshold revision. I spoke for approximately 8 minutes without interruption, and when I finished he was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "She doesn't know the full amount." I said, "I'm not certain of that." "I am." He set down his cup. "I have known my daughter for 51 years. She is capable of many things. She is not capable of knowing that number and continuing to share a building with Lim Do-kyun. I considered this. I had considered it before, and I had arrived at the same place I arrived at now, which was that the father's certainty about his daughter's limits was not the same thing as evidence about those limits, and that love, even the unsentimental kind, the kind that sits across a table and discusses its subject with apparent objectivity, was not a reliable instrument for this particular measurement. I said, "What are you asking me to do?" He said, "I'm asking you not to take the company down while she's still inside it. Separate what Lim Do-kyun did from what she did. Find the line." I said, "I've been trying to find that line for 3 days." He said, "And?" I said, "The line is harder to find than you want it to be." He looked at me for a long moment. He said, "I know. I'm not asking you to find it for her sake. I'm asking you to find it because you're the kind of person who will regret it if you don't." I drove home in the late morning light, the city moving around me in its ordinary Saturday configuration, and I thought about what he had said, and I thought about Cheon's consultant documents, and I thought about the exact 40% threshold revision, and I thought about the 14 messages in the thread between Eugene and Do-kyun that had used the phrase "the Juno situation" in the subject line. The problem with the line Seo Gwanjin was asking me to find was that Eugene had helped draw it herself. Not all of it. Perhaps not most of it. But the threshold revision was her signature. The organizational restructuring that had reduced me from head of deal architecture to senior strategic advisor was her decision. The 14 months of systematic credential removal had required, at minimum, her permission. Do-kyun had built the fraud around her, yes. But she had built the architecture that made the fraud possible, and she had done it for reasons that had less to do with Do-kyun's scheme than with her own need to be the only indispensable person in the room. That was the thing I had not been able to say in the apartment, and could not say to her father, and had been carrying since the ceremony. Not the betrayal. The reason for the betrayal. The reason was not that she loved Do-kyun. I had looked at the 14 messages carefully and love was not what I found in them. The reason was that she needed someone whose capability she could fully contain and display as her own, and I had always been too much to fully contain, and Do-kyun had arrived at exactly the moment when that became intolerable rather than merely inconvenient. She had not discarded me because I was insufficient. She had discarded me because I wasn't. I was still thinking about that when my phone lit on the passenger seat. A message from Cheon, 4 words, "The board has been briefed." A second message, arriving 12 seconds later, not by Sunggo. By Do-kyun. About you. He used the phrase "pattern of misconduct." And then a third message, 40 seconds after that, from a number I did not recognize, with a name attached that Cheon had apparently saved in her own contacts and forwarded from hers. "This is Rachel Wu, Independent Director, CO Vance Board. I was told you were the person to call if I wanted to understand what is actually happening inside this company. I've been watching for 2 weeks. I think we need to speak today. Not tomorrow. Today." I looked at that message for a long time. Rachel Wu had joined the board 14 months ago, the same month as the accounts payable threshold revision. I had never met her. Her background was forensic finance and institutional governance. She had been nominated by the minority shareholder bloc, not by Eugene. She had been watching for 2 weeks. I typed back, "Where are you now?" She replied within 10 seconds with an address in Songbukdong. A cafe I did not know. A neighborhood she had chosen deliberately for its distance from anywhere CO Vance personnel would be on a Saturday afternoon. I changed direction at the next intersection and drove north. The $399,000 had never been the point. I had said this to myself in the parking structure of the Jangyo Grand, sitting in the dark with the laptop sleeve in my lap, and I had believed it then, and I believed it more now that I could see the full architecture around it. The $399,000 was the ceremony. The 1,240,000,000 Korean wons was the rehearsal. And what Cheon had not yet found, what I had been working towards slowly, from the outside of the documentation, filling in its shape the way you fill in the shape of an object by measuring the space around it, was the performance. The performance was still running. I was driving toward the person who might be able to tell me its final act. Rachel Wu was already at the corner table when I arrived. She was 53 years old, small-framed, with the specific stillness of someone who had spent a career in rooms where stillness was an advantage. She had a cup of black coffee in front of her and a closed laptop beside it and no documents on the table, which told me she had come to listen rather than to present, and that she had already decided something before I walked through the door. She did not stand when I approached. She said, "Kong Juno. Sit down." I sat. She studied me for a moment with the particular quality of attention that forensic finance people develop, not hostile, not warm, simply calibrated, the look of someone converting visible data into a working model in real time. She said, "How much of what is happening do you understand?" I said, "Enough to know that I don't understand all of it." She said, "Good. The people who think they understand all of it are the ones Dokyun has been able to manage. You're harder to manage because you know the shape of what you don't know." She wrapped both hands around her coffee cup. "I'm going to tell you 3 things. After the third one, I need something from you. If you can give it, we move forward together. If you can't, we finish our coffee and go our separate ways and you figure out the rest yourself." I said, "Tell me." She said, "The first thing is about the board. Dokyun briefed 3 of the 5 board members this morning. He used the phrase unauthorized client solicitation and breach of fiduciary obligation. He had a prepared summary document. Printed, not digital. He handed it to each of them in person." She paused. "A prepared printed document means he had it ready before this morning. Which means the legal action your wife launched on Friday was not a decision she made this week. It was the execution of a plan that was already built." I said, "I know. I found the thread 4 days ago." She looked at me. "Which thread?" "The one where they discussed the clean exit timeline. 4 months ago." A pause. "Then, you've had that for 4 days and you haven't used it." I said, "I was waiting to understand what it was the exit from." She set down her cup. "That's the second thing." She was quiet for a moment, in the way of someone choosing how much precision to apply to a sentence they had been constructing for some time. "Dokyun approached 2 of our institutional LPs 6 weeks ago. Not on behalf of the firm. In a personal capacity. He represented himself as someone who was going to be leading a significant restructuring of Seovance's management structure and deal architecture within the next quarter, and he indicated that the restructuring would create an opportunity for the LPs to renegotiate their fee arrangements in exchange for their support during the transition." I said, "He was pre-selling the coup." She said, "He was pre-selling the coup. And the price he was offering was a reduction in management fees that Eugene would never have approved, which meant he was either planning to be in a position to override her approval or planning for her not to be in a position to give it." I sat with that for a moment. The shape of it was coming clear in the way that things come clear when you have been holding pieces in different compartments and finally put them on the same surface: the false consultants extracting money over 14 months, the systematic removal of my structural role from the company's visible architecture, the legal offensive launched before I had made a single public move, the board briefing this morning with printed materials that had been prepared in advance. Dokyun had not been building a career at Seovance. He had been building a position from which to take it. And Eugene, brilliant, controlled, strategically precise Eugene, had been so focused on the problem of me that she had not looked clearly at the problem beside her. I said, "Does she know?" Rachel said, "No. That is the third thing." She looked at me directly. "She does not know what Dokyun has been building. She knows she wanted you removed from the structural center of the company, and she used him as the instrument of that removal, and in doing so she gave him 14 months of access, authorization, and institutional credibility that he has been converting into leverage she did not understand she was creating. She is not innocent. But she is not his partner in what he's actually doing. She is his most useful tool." I was quiet for a long time. The cafe around us continued its Saturday morning indifference: 2 students at the counter, an older man reading near the window, a server moving between tables with the unhurried pace of a slow day. I said, "What does he actually want?" Rachel said, "Control of the firm's Korean mid-market deal flow. A management buyout structure that uses the LP support he's been cultivating and the consultant money he's been extracting as his equity base. He wants to take the deals, the relationships, and the institutional reputation that your wife built, that you built, and repackage them under a new entity where his name is on the door and no one is left who remembers how the underlying value was created." "And Eugene?" She has enough exposure from the threshold revision and the consultant payment approvals that, if he controls the narrative when the restructuring becomes public, she is the person who authorized the fraud rather than the person who was defrauded. He has been building that exposure deliberately for 9 months. Every payment he ran through the false consultants, he routed through an approval chain that ended with her signature, even when her signature was obtained on documents that did not describe what they were actually authorizing. I said, he set her up as the fallback. The moment he's ready to move, yes. She becomes the explanation. He becomes the cleanup. I looked at my untouched coffee. Then I looked at Rachel Wu and said, "What do you need from me?" She said, "The original documentation. Everything you have, the consultant structures, the creation timestamps, the email chains, the authorization matrix revision. But not for litigation. Not yet. I need it organized in a format that I can present to the 2 LPs he approached, before he approaches them again. If I can show them the fraud structure before he closes their commitment, he loses his equity base and his coup loses its financial foundation. The legal case becomes secondary. The structure collapses before it executes. I said, if I give you that, Eugen's exposure becomes visible to the LPs. She said, yes. Her signature on the threshold revision, the consultant approvals. Yes. I said, she will be damaged. Rachel said, she will be damaged less than if Do-kyun executes the buyout and she becomes the fraud narrative. This is the version where she survives, Juno. Diminished, exposed, held accountable for what she actually did. But not destroyed. The other version, if he finishes what he's building, is worse. I looked at her for a long moment. This was the decision that I had been approaching from 4 directions for 4 days and that I had not yet been able to make, because making it required accepting something that the part of me that had been married to Eugene for 7 years was still resisting. To stop Do-kyun, I had to use information that would hurt her. To protect her from the worst of what Do-kyun was building, I had to expose her to the lesser version of it. There was no clean path. The choice was not between hurting her and not hurting her. The choice was between hurting her now, with precision and with some control over the outcome, or letting the situation develop until Do-kyun chose the moment and the method, and the outcome was entirely his. Her father had asked me to find the line between what Do-kyun did and what she did. I had found it. The line ran directly through the threshold revision, through the consultant approval chain, through every signature she had put on a document without reading it carefully because Do-kyun had told her it was routine and she had trusted him more than she had trusted her own rigorous instincts. She had not built the fraud. But she had built the access that made the fraud possible, and she had done it at the precise moment she was most focused on removing me, which meant that the 2 things, her treatment of me and her exposure to Do-kyun, were not separate problems. They were the same problem, seen from different angles. She had been so intent on replacing the person who understood the company's structure that she had installed someone who understood it only well enough to steal it. I said, I'll send you the documentation by 9 tonight. Organized the way you described. Rachel said, one more thing. Cheon. I looked at her. She said, she found the consultant structure in 4 hours because she is very good and because she had access. Do-kyun knows she's your assistant. If he's moving as quickly as the board briefing suggests, she is the next person he tries to neutralize. Reassign her access today. Move her to a different reporting line on paper. She needs to be outside his reach before Monday. I had not thought about this. That was the most unsettling thing she had said, not the coup structure, not Eugen's exposure, but the simple operational fact that I had not thought about Cheon's position, which told me that despite 4 months of preparation I was still capable of gaps. I said, done. Rachel said, good. She stood, picked up her laptop, and said, I need to be clear about one thing before we go any further. I am doing this because it is the correct governance response to an active fraud being committed against the firm's LPs and its institutional integrity. I am not doing it to protect your wife, and I am not doing it to protect you. I am doing it because Lim Do-kyun has been treating a 40-year-old company's investor relationships as a personal asset to be acquired, and that is the specific kind of thing that I have spent my career not allowing to happen. I said, I understand. She said, I know you do. That's why I called you. She left. I sat for another 10 minutes with my cold coffee and the specific weight of what had just been confirmed. The $399,000 ceremony. The 1,240,000,000 Korean won's extraction. The LP solicitation. The board briefing. The printed documents that had been ready in advance. The approval chains that ended with Eugen's signature. The legal offensive that had been timed to land before I could establish a counterposition. It was not a revenge play. It was not a career maneuver. It was a takeover, engineered from the inside over 14 months, using the company's own authorization structure as its instrument, and it had been made possible by one decision, Eugen's decision to focus entirely on managing me out of the architecture while Do-kyun built himself in. She had handed him the keys to the building while she changed the locks on my office. I called Cheon at 4:17. I told her to switch her system access to the archival read environment, the one I had maintained separately from the main company infrastructure, my own shadow documentation system, for years of careful parallel record-keeping that Do-kyun had never known existed. I told her to do it from outside the building, on her personal device, using the VPN I had given her 6 months ago for what I had told her at the time were backup purposes and what I had actually given her because I had understood, even then, that the moment might come when the official system would be turned against us. She said, "Today?" I said, "Before 6. She said, "Is it starting?" I said, "It started on Friday when the legal letter arrived. What's changing is that now I know what it's actually about." She said, "Should I be worried?" I said, "No. But I need you careful." She said, "Careful I can do." That evening I sat at my home office desk and built the documentation package for Rachel Wu. It took 3 hours and 40 minutes. I organized it in 7 sections: the false consultant structures, the disbursement timeline, the authorization matrix revision, the LP solicitation evidence Cheon had flagged 2 weeks ago and that I now understood in its full context, the Dacian deal provenance documentation, the email chain establishing the clean exit timeline, and a final section that I labeled simply, what was taken, from whom, and how. I sent it to Rachel at 9:03. At 9:17, Eugene called. I did not answer. She left no voicemail. At 9:44, Do-kyun called from a number I recognized as his personal phone, not his company line. I did not answer. At 10:01, Jang Min-jun sent a message, "Kim Se-inchul filed the injunction application tonight. Emergency basis. They're trying to freeze your client engagements before Monday morning." I read that message and felt something clarify into a single, clean point, the way a complex calculation resolves into a final number. They were moving because they were afraid. Afraid people moved early and they moved imprecisely. Do-kyun had pushed Eugene to file the emergency injunction because the board briefing had not produced the outcome he expected, Park Sung-go had not capitulated, Rachel Wu had not aligned, and someone in that building had made a phone call that Do-kyun had not anticipated. I replied to Jang, "Let it file. We respond Monday with the full documentation. All 7 sections." He replied, "Understood. Sleep if you can." I turned off the desk lamp. The city outside was doing what it always did, indifferent and continuous, and I sat for a moment in the dark and thought about the man who had walked into the Jeonnyo Grand dining room 3 weeks ago and sat in the third table from the front and watched the applause and felt the specific quality of stillness that was not calm but its architectural imitation. That man had known something was broken. He had not yet known how large the break was, or how many people were inside it, or how long it had been growing in the dark. Now he knew. The question that remained was not what to do. The question was how to do it in a way that he could live with when it was finished. He was still working on the answer. Monday arrived the way consequential days often do, without announcement, in ordinary light, with the city moving at its usual pace outside a window that did not know what the day contained. I was at my desk at 7:14 when Jang Min-jun called to confirm that our response to the injunction had been filed at 7:01, the earliest the court clerk's office accepted electronic submissions. 7 sections. Full documentation. The complete provenance of every piece of work the trade secret claim had named, with timestamps, edit histories, email chains, and 3 years of parallel records that the official Seovance system had never contained because I had maintained them separately, precisely for this reason. Jang said, "Kim Se-inchul will see it by 8. His client will see it by 8:30. I said, "Good." He said, "Juno. The LP section. You included the solicitation records. I said, yes. A pause. That implicates the board briefing Dokyun ran on Saturday. It makes this bigger than a divorce and a non-compete dispute. I said, it was always bigger than that. I was the last one to understand how much bigger. He said, when Kim Seonchul shows this to Eugene, she is going to understand that Dokyun has been building against her. Not just around you. Against her. I said, I know. He said, and you filed it anyway. I said, she filed the injunction on a Friday night on an emergency basis to freeze my professional life before Monday morning. I filed the truth on Monday morning. That is the proportionate response. He was quiet for a moment. Then, I'll call you when I hear from their side. He called at 9:47. Not with news from Kim Seonchul. With something I had not predicted. He said, Eugene called me directly. My personal number. Not through Kim Seonchul. She asked if she could speak with you today. Without lawyers. She said, and I'm reading this exactly, I need him to understand something that I cannot explain through counsel because counsel will make it sound like strategy and it is not strategy. It is the truth and I need to say it to him directly. I sat with that for a moment. The phrasing was not Eugene performing. The phrasing was Eugene stripped of her register, which happened rarely and only when she had run out of the controlled language she preferred to operate in. I had heard it twice before in 7 years, once when her grandmother died and once on the night she told me that the company's first major client had withdrawn and she was not sure she had built something that would survive. Both times she had been telling the truth. I said, tell her I'll meet her at 1. The apartment. No Dokyun, no counsel, no staff. Jang said, you're certain? I said, no. But I'm going. She was already there when I arrived. She had made tea, which she never did. She drank coffee, always, and made tea only for guests she was uncertain about, a habit from her mother that she had never acknowledged and probably did not realize she still carried. The cups were on the kitchen counter and she was standing at the window with her back to the door, looking at the city in the way of someone who has been standing there long enough for it to stop being something they were looking at and become something they were using as an excuse not to look at anything else. She turned when she heard the door. She looked tired in a way that her professional composure had always previously concealed. Not sleep-tired. The other kind, the kind that comes from holding a version of events together by will alone for long enough that the will is starting to fail. She said, you filed the LP documentation. I said, yes. She said, you knew about the LP solicitation. I said, since last week. She sat at the kitchen table. She did not gesture for me to sit, which meant the formality she defaulted to under pressure had dissolved enough that she was not managing the geometry of the room. I sat across from her because it was the sensible place to sit. She said, tell me what you know. All of it. Not as an adversary. As the person who understands this company's structure better than anyone living. I looked at her for a moment. This was the thing I had not expected, not the request itself, but the specific way she made it. Not tell me what you have on him. Not tell me what you filed. But, tell me as the person who understands this. She was asking me to be what I had been for 7 years, one final time, in service of a situation that had been created in large part by her decision to stop treating me as that person. I told her. The consultant structures, the 4 entities, the MAPO address, the total amount. The authorization threshold revision. I watched her face at that point, and what I saw was not guilt but something more complicated, the expression of someone who was not surprised by the fact but had not understood its meaning until this moment, had signed the revision as an administrative matter without recognizing that it had been engineered specifically to move every consultant payment below her oversight threshold. She had not known. Her father had been right about that. She had not known, and the not knowing had been architected by someone who understood her approval patterns well enough to design around them. I told her about the LP solicitation. She was still at this part. Very still. I told her about the board briefing on Saturday, the printed documents prepared in advance, the framing, the phrase pattern of misconduct. I told her about Rachel Wu. When I finished, she was quiet for a long time. Long enough that the refrigerator cycled through a full noise cycle and finished, and the apartment returned to the kind of silence that only exists in places where two people are not speaking to each other by choice. She said, he was going to use my signatures. I said, yes. She said, every approval I gave him, he structured them so that when it became public, the paper trail read as my fraud, not his. I said, yes. She said, and you knew this and you still filed it. I said, I filed it because it was the truth, and because if I waited for a version of the truth that didn't damage you, Do-kyun would finish the buyout structure before anyone had the full picture. She looked at me. You're protecting the company. I said, I'm stopping him. They're not the same thing, but in this case they produce similar actions. She said, and me? I said, you built the access that made this possible. You signed documents you should have read more carefully. You will have to account for that. But you are not the architect of the fraud. That distinction matters legally, and it matters in terms of what happens to the company afterward. She was quiet again. Then she said something I had not expected her to say, in a register I had not heard in approximately 2 years. I'm sorry, Juno. I looked at her. She said, not for the right reasons, maybe. Maybe partly because the thing I'm most sorry about is that I made myself so focused on managing you out of the picture that I stopped seeing what was in the picture. But also, she stopped. Restarted. I knew what you built. I always knew. I told myself the story that you were building it for the company, for us, for the collective, and that taking credit for it publicly was a structural necessity because the investors needed a single face and the clients needed a single name and the board needed a CEO who looked like she had built something herself. And all of those things were partly true. And I used them to cover for something that was not true, which was that I was afraid of what it meant that you were better at the structural work than I was. And I chose someone who was worse at everything, because worse was easier to manage. I sat with that for a long time. The honest answer, the full answer, was that I had known this for approximately 18 months, had known the motivation even if not the specific internal language she used for it, and that knowing it had not made it less painful, and that hearing her say it now was not the relief I might have imagined it would be in those months when I was still hoping she would say it. It was something quieter than relief and heavier than vindication. I said, what do you need from me? She said, I need you to help me stop him. Not for my sake. For the people in the company who had nothing to do with any of this, the analysts, the operations team, the client managers. If Do-kyun executes the buyout structure and the fraud surfaces the way he planned it, they lose their jobs inside a reputational collapse, and none of them knew it was coming. I said, Rachel Wu is already moving on the LP side. If the two LPs withdraw their commitments, his equity base for the buyout dissolves. She said, he'll have a contingency. I said, I know. Which is why I need access to something I don't currently have. She looked at me. I said, his internal communications. Everything routed through the company system in the last 6 months. Deal correspondence, advisory channel messages, calendar records. I need to see the full shape of what he built and who he built it with, and I need it before he realizes that the LP move is happening and starts deleting. She was quiet for a moment. That requires a board resolution for a forensic access order. Or CEO authorization under the IT governance policy. I said, yes. She understood what I was asking. I was asking her to use the authority she still formally held because the board had not yet acted, and Kim Seonchul's injunction had not yet been ruled on, and she was still CEO of record, to authorize a forensic pull of Do-kyun's communications on the grounds of a compliance investigation. It was within her legal authority to do. It was the most exposed she would be in any subsequent proceeding, authorizing an investigation into someone she had publicly championed, and it would make everything that followed harder for her personally. She said, if I authorize this, it is in the record that I knew. I said, if you don't authorize it, Do-kyun controls the timeline and the narrative, and when the fraud surfaces on his terms, the record shows that you had the authority to investigate and chose not to. She looked at her hands on the table. I watched her make the calculation, not the emotional calculation, the structural one, the kind she had always been genuinely good at when she allowed herself to use it honestly. She said, send me the authorization template. I'll sign it today. She signed it at 3:44. I forwarded it to Jang and to Rachel Wu simultaneously. Zhang filed it with the company's IT governance officer, who was a careful, quiet man named Oh Sung-bae who had worked at Seovance for 9 years and who had the specific quality of institutional professionals who execute procedures correctly regardless of the political environment, which was precisely the quality needed in the next 18 hours. Before I left, Eugene said one more thing. She said it standing at the kitchen counter, not looking at me, in the tone of someone who has decided to say something they know they cannot unsay. I told Do-kyun 4 months ago that the exit timeline needed to be clean. That you needed to leave without a legal fight because a legal fight would create discovery that would complicate things. He agreed. He said he would manage it. She paused. I didn't ask how. I should have asked how. That was the moment I stopped being someone who runs a company and became someone who was being run by a plan they don't fully understand. I said, I know. She said, you knew that 4 months ago too. I said, I knew the shape of it. Not every specific. She said, you were preparing. I said, yes. She said, good. I'm glad one of us was. I took the elevator down. In the lobby I stood for a moment before pushing through the glass door into the afternoon. The authorization had been signed. The forensic pull was in motion. Rachel Wu had the LP documentation. Zhang had the full evidentiary filing. Chan was secured. Every piece was in place. What remained was the question of whether Do-kyun would understand what was moving toward him quickly enough to try to run, and what he would do if he did. Frightened people moved imprecisely. Chan had said that on Friday, and she had been right, and the board briefing and the emergency injunction had confirmed it. The question now was not whether he was frightened. The question was how much damage a frightened man with 14 months of institutional access could do in the hours before the net closed. I pushed through the door. The afternoon light was flat and even, the city indifferent, the next move already in progress, the forensic pull completed at 11:47 Tuesday morning. Oh Sung-bae called me directly, not Eugene, not Zhang, me, which told me he had understood from the moment the authorization crossed his desk that the person who needed to see the results first was the person who would know what they meant. He was that kind of professional. The kind that understood that procedure and judgment were not the same instrument and that good institutional work required both. He said, the pull is complete. 61 gigabytes of communications, calendar records, and file access logs covering the past 7 months. I've flagged 3 categories that I think you'll want to review before anything else. He paused. Mr. Kong, I have been at this company for 9 years. I want you to know that what I found in the first hour of this review is the worst thing I have seen in 9 years of institutional work. I am telling you that so you are prepared for the scale of it before you open the files. I said, send them to me and to Zhang Minjun simultaneously. He said, already done. I opened the files at 12:03. Sitting at my home office desk with a second monitor I had set up specifically for document review and a legal pad to my left for the kind of notes that needed to be made by hand rather than typed, because handwritten notes think differently than typed ones, and this was the kind of material that required a different kind of thinking. Oh Sung-bae's 3 flagged categories were labeled with the neutral descriptive language of someone who had spent years documenting things that required accuracy rather than expression. The first category was titled, External Entity Communications, Non-Company Addresses. The second, LP Contact Records, Unauthorized Channel. The third, Document Modification Logs, Deal Archive. I started with the third category because it was the one I had not anticipated and because anything that surprised me at this stage required immediate attention. The Document Modification Logs covered 37 files in the company's official deal archive. Each log entry showed the original file, its creation date and author, and the modification record. In 34 of the 37 files, the modification was the same type of change, authorship metadata, revised. Original author field, cleared. Contributing author field, populated with a single name. Lim Do-kyun. 34 files. The earliest modification dated 16 months ago, 2 months before the accounts payable threshold revision. The most recent dated 6 days ago, 72 hours before the legal letter arrived. He had been rewriting the archive of the company's deal history. Not the deals themselves, the records of who had built them. Systematically, over 16 months, he had converted the official institutional memory of Seovance Capital Partners into a history in which he was the primary architect of its most significant work. If the buyout had executed as planned, if Rachel Wu's LP intervention had not been moving, if Eugene had not signed the forensic authorization, if the documentation package had not been filed Monday morning, the company that Do-kyun acquired would have carried an official record showing him as the creator of its value. The fraud would not have needed to be explained. It would have been embedded in the institutional history itself. I sat with that for approximately 2 minutes. Not from shock, I had understood the scale of what he was building since Saturday afternoon in the cafe in Songbukdong. From something more precise, the recognition that what he had done to the archive was the same thing that had been done to me over 14 months, elevated to a systematic institutional operation. He had learned the method from watching it applied to one person and had decided to apply it to an entire company's history. I called Jang at 12:22. He said, "I'm in the third category." I said, "So am I." He said, 34 files. I said, "Yes." He said, "Juno, this is not a civil matter anymore." I said, "I know." He said, "The LP solicitation combined with the archive modification and the false consultant structure, that is fraud, breach of fiduciary duty, and potentially criminal falsification of corporate records. This goes to the Financial Crimes Unit." I said, "After the board meeting. I want the board to see the full picture before any external filing, because if the regulator moves before the board acts, Do-kyun's lawyers will argue that the investigation is adversarial rather than institutional, and that argument will slow everything by months. Let the board resolution come first." 24 hours. Jang said, "That is a significant risk." I said, "The alternative is giving him time to argue procedure while the actual fraud evidence sits in a regulator's intake queue. The board meeting neutralizes him institutionally before the criminal process begins. He loses the ability to present himself as a legitimate actor who is being persecuted." A pause. "You've thought about this sequence for a while." I said, "Since Saturday." He said, "I'll prepare the board presentation. We'll need Rachel Wu to call the meeting." I said, "She already has." Thursday morning. She called it last night under the Independent Director emergency provision. I found out an hour ago. He was quiet for a moment. "Then, you and Rachel Wu have been moving in parallel." I said, "We have been moving toward the same point from different directions. That is not quite the same thing, but the result is similar." Do-kyun understood something was wrong by Wednesday afternoon. Cheon, who had maintained a careful presence in the building through the week, present enough to observe, positioned far enough from Do-kyun's operational orbit to remain outside his attention, sent me a message at 2:51. He's been in his office with the door closed since noon. His assistant has declined 3 client calls on his behalf. He had a 60-minute call at 1:15 that wasn't on the official calendar. His printer ran for 40 minutes straight at 2:30. I read that and thought about what 40 minutes of printing meant. It meant either preparation or destruction. Either he was building something to present or he was generating paper versions of things he intended to remove from digital records. Both were possible. Both told me the same thing: he knew the net was closing and he was deciding whether to fight or to run. I replied to Cheon, "Stay out of his floor for the rest of the day. Go home at 5. Normal time. Normal exit." She replied, "Understood." One more thing, Park Sung-go went into Do-kyun's office at 3:05. He was inside for 8 minutes. When he came out, he walked directly to his own office and called someone. I could hear his voice through the wall but not the words. He sounded angry. I thought about Park Sung-go for a moment. He had been Eugen's CFO for 11 years. He had watched the organizational shift with the specific discomfort of someone who understood what was happening and had lacked either the information or the institutional courage to name it until the pension fund call had made the consequences concrete. He had called me the previous week and said, "I think we have a problem that goes beyond this morning." He had not been wrong. He had been, if anything, significantly understating it. I called Sung-go at 3:44. He answered on the first ring, which meant he had been waiting for contact. He said, "Do-kyun knows the forensic pull happened. Someone in IT told him. Not Sung-bae, someone else, one of the junior administrators. He asked me this afternoon to sign a document authorizing a counter-investigation into unauthorized access to executive communications. I told him I didn't have that authority. He said Eugene had already agreed to sign it. I said, she hasn't. I know. I called her after he left. She said she hadn't signed anything and that I should call you immediately. I said, Sungo, tomorrow morning at 9 there is a board meeting called by Rachel Wu. I need you to be there and I need you to bring the full accounts payable records for the past 18 months, the originals, not the system versions. Physical copies from the backup archive. He said, the backup archive requires dual authorization. I said, you have standing authorization as CFO for compliance-related access. This is compliance-related. A pause. Then, what is tomorrow going to be? I said, the end of it. He said, for who? I said, for the version of things that Do-kyun built. What comes after that depends on decisions that other people will make. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, in a voice that carried the specific weight of someone who had been holding a position through great discomfort for a very long time, I should have called you 8 months ago. When I first saw the threshold revision and it didn't make sense to me. I should have come to you then. I said, you're coming to me now. Bring the records. Thursday morning. 9:04. The boardroom at Seovance occupied the northeast corner of the 14th floor, a room I had sat in 40 or 50 times over 7 years and that looked exactly as it always had, the long table, the credenza along the wall, the view of the city that Eugene had once described as the room's best feature and that I had always found mildly distracting during complex presentations. 5 board members. Rachel Wu at the head of the table, which was unusual. The head position was conventionally the CEO's, and which told everyone in the room before she spoke a single word that this meeting was not being run on conventional authority. Park Sungo along the wall with a banker's box of physical records. Jang Minjun beside me with a laptop and the complete evidentiary package organized into a presentation he had prepared through the night. Eugene sat 3 seats from the head. Not in her customary position at the other end. 3 seats from Rachel. It was a precise piece of spatial communication, the kind that Eugene was normally expert at deploying herself. She was present as a participant rather than as the chair of the proceedings. She had chosen that positioning herself. I had noticed it when I walked in and had not been able to decide whether it represented capitulation or calculation or the specific kind of dignity that comes from understanding your position accurately and placing yourself in it without being placed. Do-kyun arrived at 9:08, 4 minutes late, which was not accidental. 4 minutes late to a 9 o'clock board meeting was a statement, I am not subject to your timeline. He was wearing the same calibrated professional presentation he always wore, jacket, open collar, the appearance of someone who moved through institutions on his own terms. He looked around the room, registered its configuration, registered Jang Minjun's presence, registered the banker's box, and sat down without speaking. Rachel Wu opened the meeting with a single sentence, this session has been called under Section 14.3 of the company's Articles of Association, which grants independent directors the authority to convene a compliance and governance review when evidence of material institutional risk has been identified. The session is being recorded. All participants have been notified. We begin. She looked at me. I stood. What followed was not dramatic in the way that dramatic things are portrayed, no raised voices in the first 40 minutes, no confrontations, no moments designed for effect. It was methodical. Jang ran the presentation. I spoke to the content. Park Sungo confirmed the accounts payable records at the points where they were referenced. Rachel Wu managed the board members' questions with the precision of someone who had been a forensic finance practitioner for 25 years and who understood that the purpose of the session was not to perform clarity but to produce it. The 4 consultant entities. The disbursement timeline. The MAPO registration address. The shared registered agent. The Yonsei roommate. The authorization threshold revision. At this point one of the board members, a quiet 60-year-old named Young Hyasuk who had served on the board for 4 years and whom I had always found the most genuinely analytical of the 5, put down his pen and looked at the revision document for a long time without saying anything, which was a specific kind of response that told me he was doing the same calculation I had done and arriving at the same place. The LP solicitation. I watched the 2 board members who had been briefed by Do-kyun on Saturday receive the documentation of what he had actually said to the LPs, and I watched them understand that they had been given a version of events designed to produce their support for a transaction that had not been what it was presented as. Neither of them looked at Do-kyun. The archive modification logs. 34 files. 16 months. The systematic rewriting of institutional memory. At this point, Do-kyun spoke for the first time. He said, "These modification logs show routine metadata updates. Every company updates authorship records when deal teams change composition. This is being presented as sinister when it is standard document management practice." The room was quiet. Then Rachel Wu said, "Mr. Lim, I have the original creation records for each of the 34 files. I have the email chains in which the original authors submitted the work. I have the client correspondence referencing the original authors by name. I also have," she looked at me, and I placed the final document set on the table, and Zhang distributed copies, a comparative analysis prepared by an independent forensic document examiner showing that the modification pattern across all 34 files is consistent with a single coordinated operation rather than routine administrative updates. The examiner's conclusion is that the modifications were made systematically, with a single outcome, replacement of original authorship attribution, and that this pattern is inconsistent with any standard document management practice I am aware of in 25 years of institutional governance work. Do-kyun looked at the document. He looked at it for a long time. When he looked up, his expression had changed, not broken, not openly afraid, but recalibrated, the expression of someone who has understood that the position he thought he held does not exist in the form he believed it did and is processing what positions remain available. He said, "I want to speak with my legal counsel before this session continues." Rachel said, "You are welcome to do that. This session will continue with or without your participation, and your departure will be noted in the record." He stayed. The final section of the presentation covered the LP solicitation in full. Rachel had received, that morning, written statements from both LP representatives confirming the substance of Do-kyun's approach, that he had represented himself as leading an imminent management restructuring, that he had offered fee reductions outside any authorized framework, and that he had characterized Eugen's continued tenure as uncertain. The statements had been obtained through Rachel's independent board authority and were admissible as part of the governance record. When Zhang finished presenting the LP statements, the room was the quietest it had been since the session began. Rachel Wu said, "The board will now consider a resolution." She looked at each board member in turn. The resolution has 3 components. First, the immediate suspension of Lim Do-kyun's executive authority and access pending a formal investigation. Second, the referral of the documented fraud to the Financial Supervisory Service and, where the archive modifications meet the relevant threshold, to the Criminal Division of the Seoul Central District Prosecutor's Office. Third, the commissioning of an independent governance audit of all compensation decisions, authorization matrix changes, and deal attribution records for the past 24 months. Young Hyasuk said, "I move the resolution." The second board member, a woman named Park Ji-yeon who had said nothing during the entire presentation and whose silence had been of the specific quality that signals careful accumulation rather than disengagement, said, "Seconded." The vote was 4-0. The fifth board member, who had been one of the 2 briefed by Do-kyun on Saturday, abstained. It was noted in the record. Do-kyun stood when the vote was recorded. His chair moved back from the table with the sound of someone leaving under their own power rather than being removed, which was the last piece of control he exercised in that room. He looked at the table rather than at any individual. He said, "This is not finished." Rachel Wu said, "Please return your access credentials to the IT office before leaving the building. Security will accompany you." He left. 2 members of the building's security team, whom Rachel had arranged to be present in the corridor, accompanied him to his office and then to the lobby. It took 23 minutes. I know because I stayed in the boardroom and the meeting continued, and when the security team lead called Rachel's phone to confirm the exit it was 9:51, which meant the entire formal proceeding from opening to his departure had taken 47 minutes. 47 minutes to dismantle 16 months of constructed position. After the security confirmation, the board members began the procedural steps that followed a resolution of this kind: calls to legal counsel, notification to the company's compliance officer, the beginning of the documentation chain that would accompany the regulatory referral. Rachel Wu managed it with the efficiency of someone who had prepared the choreography in advance. Eugene had not spoken during the session. Not once. She had sat 3 seats from the head of the table and received everything that was presented with the expression of someone who was experiencing, in real time, the full shape of a situation that she had understood in fragments and was now understanding whole. When the resolution passed, she had closed her eyes briefly. Not from relief. From something more complex than relief, the specific emotion of someone who has been shown, in the most detailed and public way available, the precise cost of every decision they made in the wrong direction. After the room began to empty, she remained seated. I gathered my documents. Jang was already on his phone in the corridor. Park Sung-go was repacking the banker's box with the careful movements of someone who needed something to do with his hands. I was at the door when Eugene said my name. I stopped. Turned. She said, "The archive. The 34 files. Can it be corrected?" I said, "The original records exist in the backup system. The forensic examiner has authenticated them. The correction is procedural from here." She said, "Will you?" She stopped. Start it again. The company will need someone to oversee the governance audit. Someone who knows the deal history from the inside. Who knows what the original records should say. I looked at her for a moment. The city was visible through the window behind her, flat and gray in the morning light, indifferent as always. I said, "I'll provide a written account of my contributions to each of the flagged deals. Jang can transmit it to the audit team. That is what I can offer." She said, "That's not the same as being here." I said, "No. It isn't." She looked at me. She did not argue. She had understood, I think, from the moment I walked through the apartment door on Monday afternoon, that the alliance we had formed to stop Dokyun was exactly that, an alliance, not a restoration. Two people who had once built something together, using the knowledge they still shared of how it had been built, to prevent it from being taken by someone who had built nothing and claimed everything. That was what it was. Not more. I had been clear about that with myself since Monday, and I was clear about it now, standing in the doorway of the boardroom with the documentation of 9 years in a folder under my arm and the city gray and continuous behind her. I said, "The audit team will have everything they need." I walked out. In the elevator on the way down, I stood with the folder and the specific quality of stillness that I had first noticed in myself in the parking structure of the Jangmyo Grand, the one that was not calm but its architectural imitation, the body's emergency response. Except that this time it was not emergency stillness. It was the other kind. The kind that comes after. The elevator reached the lobby. The doors opened. Outside, the city was doing what it always did. I walked through the glass doors into it and kept walking, and behind me the building that had contained 9 years of my professional life continued its indifferent existence, holding what it held, and I did not look back. There was one more thing left to do. Not in that building. Not with those people. The last part was quieter than everything that had come before it, and it was entirely mine. The governance audit took 11 days. I provided my written account on the first day, 43 pages, 1 section per deal, organized in the same plain formatting I used for all professional documents, without rhetoric and without self-pity, because the work did not require either. It described what I had built, when I had built it, who had known, and what the original record showed. The forensic team cross-referenced it against the authenticated backup files and found no material discrepancies. The audit lead, a woman from an independent governance firm who introduced herself simply as Director Han and who conducted the entire 11 days with the specific economy of someone billing by the hour and respecting both parties' time, called me on the 4th day to ask 3 clarifying questions and on the 11th day to say that the account had been accepted in full and incorporated into the final report. I was not present for the report's delivery to the board. I had not been asked to be, and I had not asked to be. What happened inside that building after I walked out on Thursday morning was no longer my problem to manage. I had given them everything they needed to manage it themselves. Whether they used it correctly was their responsibility, not mine. The Financial Supervisory Service opened a formal investigation on the 9th day. The prosecutor's office received the archive modification referral on the 12th. Dokyun's legal team filed a procedural challenge on the 14th, which was dismissed on the 16th. I know these dates because Zhang sent me brief updates as each threshold passed, not because I was monitoring the proceedings but because I had asked him to confirm each step so that I could close the corresponding section of the folder I had been maintaining for 4 months and which I wanted to be able to close completely, methodically, in the same order it had been built. The last section closed on the 17th day. I deleted the folder from my desktop. I kept the physical copies in a locked drawer, because the physical copies were documentation and documentation was not the same as the ongoing mental architecture of preparation, and I was done with the ongoing mental architecture. The physical copies were history. I was finished living in them. Choi Won-jae called on the 18th day. He said, "I've been patient." I said, "You have." He said, "Are you ready to talk properly now?" I said, "Yes." We met at his office at Meridian Asia Capital, a space I had never been inside before despite 3 years of parallel professional existence in the same mid-market ecosystem. It was a smaller office than Siovance, deliberately so. Choi Won-jae had built his firm to a specific scale and kept it there, which I had always found interesting, because most people in his position built toward expansion as a reflex and he had decided that the right size was a considered position rather than a temporary state. He had coffee ready. He said, "Tell me what you actually want to build." I told him. Not the revenge architecture, not the exit protocol, not the legal strategy, all of that was finished and belonged to the previous chapter. I told him what I had been thinking about for 3 years before any of this began, in the hours I spent on problems that Siovance's official structure had no category for, the structural approaches to mid-market deals that I had developed in the margins of 14 projects and never had the institutional space to pursue as a coherent methodology. He listened for 40 minutes without interruption. When I finished he said, "That's a firm." I said, "Yes." He said, "Not a department. Not a team within an existing structure. A firm." I said, "Yes." He said, "Under your name." I said, "Under the work's name." Which is the same thing, but I want to be precise about the order of priority. He looked at me for a moment. Then he said, "I can offer you a seed partnership structure. Meridian provides the infrastructure and the LP relationships for the first 2 years. You provide the deal architecture and the client development. At the end of 2 years, you have the option to buy out the infrastructure partnership and operate independently or continue under a revised arrangement. No non-compete. No credit clause. Your name on every document you author from day one." I said, "Send me the term sheet." He said, "I'll have it tomorrow." I said, "Choi Won-jae, why did you wait 3 years?" He looked at his coffee. "Because the right time to make this offer was when you were ready to receive it as a beginning rather than as a rescue. If I had made it 2 years ago you would have taken it as an escape and built something slightly smaller than what you're capable of because the motivation would have been wrong." He paused. "I was waiting for you to want the thing itself rather than want to leave the other thing." I thought about that for a moment. It was one of the most accurate assessments anyone had offered me in recent memory, and I received it as such. I said, "You were right to wait." He said, "I know." It was still hard to watch. Cheyenne came to my home office on a Thursday morning, 3 weeks after the board meeting, carrying a bag from the coffee shop 2 streets over and a folder under her arm. She had resigned from Siovance on the same day I walked out of the boardroom, a decision she had apparently made several weeks earlier and had been waiting for the right moment to execute. She had not told me in advance, which I respected. It was her decision and her timing and it required neither my permission nor my guidance. She sat across from me and put the folder on the desk and said, "I've been thinking about the firm structure." I said, "Tell me." She spent 20 minutes walking me through a preliminary organizational model she had built over the previous 2 weeks, lean, precise, structured around the specific kind of work I had described to Choi Won-jae, with a documentation architecture she had designed from scratch rather than adapting from the Siovance model, because she had decided, correctly, that the new structure should not be the old structure improved but something built from a different set of first principles. When she finished I said, "How long did this take you?" She said, "I started it the night you filed the documentation with Zhang. The night of the ceremony." She paused. I knew then what the next thing was going to need to look like. I just needed to wait until you were ready to look at it. I looked at the model. It was good. Better than good, it was the kind of work that could only be produced by someone who understood the substance deeply enough to build the structure around it rather than applying a generic framework and hoping it held. For years of watching how I worked, what the problems actually were, where the conventional approaches failed. I said, Cheyenne, I'm building a firm. She said, I know. I said, I need a head of operations and documentation architecture. She said, I know that too. I said, the compensation structure is equity-based for the first 2 years while the Meridian partnership is running. After that it converts to salary plus equity. The equity percentage is, she said, whatever you think is fair. I trust your arithmetic. I looked at her for a moment. For years, and she had never once asked me to justify a structural decision I had made, not because she was deferential but because she had understood each decision well enough to assess it herself and had found the assessments sound. That was a different thing from deference and considerably rarer. I said, 8%. She said, that's too much. I said, it's what the contribution warrants. I'd done the arithmetic. She said, fine. She picked up her coffee. When do we start? I said, we already started. Eugene called on a Sunday afternoon, 5 weeks after the board meeting, from her personal number. Not through lawyers. Not through intermediaries. I answered. She said, the board accepted the audit report. The governance recommendations are being implemented. Rachel Wu is chairing an oversight committee for the next 18 months. A pause. I've been asked to step down as CEO. Not immediately. A transition period of 4 months while they identify a replacement and I manage the knowledge transfer. I said, I heard. She said, I wanted to tell you myself. I said, I appreciate that. A longer pause. The kind that contains more than either party is prepared to place into words. She said, the audit report. The way your contributions were documented. It was, she stopped. People in the industry are going to read that report, Juno. The ones who were always too polite to say what they knew. They're going to see it in writing, officially, what you actually built. I said, that was not why I provided the account. She said, I know. That's why it matters that I'm saying it. Another pause. Are you building something new? I said, yes. She said, good. The word arrived simply, without the register she used for professional endorsements, without the warmth she used for performances of support. Just the word, flat and direct and genuine, the way she had spoken in the early years when she was not yet performing anything for anyone. I said, Eugene. She said, yes. I said, I hope you build something real too. Not from scratch, you have enough. But something that's actually yours. Not the version of yours that required someone else to disappear inside it. She was quiet for a long time. When she spoke her voice had the quality I had heard twice in 7 years, the unperformative register, the one that only appeared when she had run out of the language she preferred. She said, I know what I did. I've known for a while. I just kept not looking at it directly. I said, I know. She said, is there anything? She stopped. I waited. She did not finish the sentence, because there was no version of it that asked a question she had the right to ask anymore, and she understood that. I said, take care of yourself, Eugene. She said, you too. I put the phone down. The apartment was quiet. Outside, the city continued its ordinary operations, traffic, construction somewhere to the north, a delivery motorcycle in the street below. The usual indifferent machinery of a city that did not know or care what had just concluded in a 4th-floor apartment on a Sunday afternoon. I sat for a moment. Then I opened the laptop and pulled up the term sheet Choi Won-jae had sent in the organizational model Cheyenne had built in the single-page document I had been drafting for a week that would become the founding statement of the new firm, not a mission statement in the conventional sense, not the kind of language that appears on websites and says very little with great confidence, but a precise description of what the firm would do, how it would do it, and whose name would be on the work. My name. Not as a brand, not as a face, not as the public identity of something built on someone else's invisible labor. As the accurate attribution of the person who did the work, which was the only thing it had ever needed to be and the only thing I had ever actually wanted. I started writing at 3:41 on a Sunday afternoon. The city outside was gray and continuous. Cheyenne was somewhere on the other side of it, probably working on something she had not told me about yet, which was fine. The term sheet was open. The model was open. The founding statement was taking shape in the plain formatting I used for all professional documents, without rhetoric and without self-pity. A beginning looks different from an ending only in retrospect. In the moment, they feel the same quality of stillness, the same flat light, the same city that does not know and does not care. The difference is what you do next. I kept writing.